Hi there, and welcome to the introduction to the Consciousness Studies concentration here at Goddard College. I'm Hilary Webb, the Consciousness Studies Concentration Coordinator at GGI. And this lecture, I will be talking a little bit about what it means to do consciousness studies at Goddard College. So I've got a slideshow prepared and we'll just dive in. So in this video, I'll be discussing the core concepts and learning areas in the study of consciousness, or put more simply, the four domains by which we can approach the study of consciousness. I'll be discussing the importance of defining consciousness for yourself in order to ground the specific research that you yourself do. And I'll give you my own loose definition, how I come at consciousness. We'll look at the current concentration requirements, or basically what will be expected of you as a consciousness studies student here at GGI. And I'll give you some of my thoughts about the value of developing a consciousness studies community. Then after the video is complete, we can proceed with questions and discussions. And this, of course, is always my favorite part because we get to talk about our own work and what excites us about this very mysterious, wonderful, and exciting field of study. So let's get into it. Before we dive into the topic of how we study consciousness, let's talk about why we study consciousness. That is, when studying the mystery of consciousness, what is it that we want to know? What are we trying to uncover in our research? So, as I've said here up on the screen, speaking very generally, what we might want to know is, what it does, and what it, quote unquote, super does. And I will briefly explain what I mean by each of these. So the what it is. By this, I mean, what is the ultimate nature of consciousness? What is the thing that it is ultimately reducible to? Now, historically, the thought around this is generally being split into three distinct camps. There is the materialist perspective, which argues that matter is the only true substance and that consciousness is a byproduct of physiochemical processes. In contrast to this, you've got subjective idealism, which takes the position that mind is primary, with matter believed to be an illusion created by the mind. And then finally, we have the dualist perspective, which suggests that mind and body are two equally real and irreducible substances that somehow link up, even if we don't know how. And so for many researchers, this question of the ultimate nature of consciousness is a central quest. And what it does, in addition to seeking insight into its ultimate nature, researchers in the field of consciousness studies may also want to know, what does consciousness do? So that is, how does it function to support the individual's existence? Or in some cases, how does it seemingly act self-destructively against the individual's apparent best interests? Along with this, we might ask, how do individuals and/or particular cultures understand the nature of consciousness, and what does this understanding lead to in terms of making meaning of their experiences as beings in the world? Now, then the final one is what it super does. And so this, for me, is sort of pointing at the question of its potential. What is human consciousness capable of beyond our current understanding of it, and/or beyond what we're able to measure? So, for example, this might include the study of anomalous experiences such as psychic phenomenon, non-ordinary healing powers, the continuation of consciousness beyond death, and so on and so forth. So here at Goddard, we tend to split the study of consciousness into four overlapping fields of research that you'll see diagrammed here. We've got the scientific, the philosophical, the social scientific, and the arts and humanities. Now, of course, this list isn't totally exhaustive, but I do think it gives at least a pretty good starting point for the ways in which those of us involved in the study of consciousness can kind of get at the questions of what consciousness is, what it does, and what it super does. And of course, each field has its own emphasis on which question it is most interested in illuminating. I'll go through these 4 fields one by one, but just to say again that while these are their own distinct fields, they're not entirely separate from one another, as you'll see by the way they overlap and interlink. So we'll start with the scientific. So here we have the scientific domain. Specific fields within this domain include neuroscience, biology, cognitive science, etc. Consciousness is studied empirically, typically in this domain, using quantitative methodologies that focuses on observation and on repeated and repeatable testing. And if you are a consciousness studies concentration student and you gravitate towards this particular domain, lots you could get into, but you might, for example, decide to design a study such as, what does EEG research tell us about the usefulness or non-usefulness of binaural beats as a brainwave entrainment tool, just as one example. Then we have the philosophical domain. And in contrast to the scientific domain, the philosophical study of consciousness tends to be based around the logical arguments as opposed to verifiable, repeatable experiments. In a way, they tend to be framed as sort of like thought experiments about what consciousness is, does, and super does. Fields falling within this category include philosophy of mind, religion and spirituality, metaphysics, etc. If somebody wanted to study consciousness from the philosophical domain, they might ask a research question, such as what I did when I was a master's student at Goddard, which was, how do certain spiritual, philosophical, and psychological systems envision the opposites of existence as being complementary rather than antagonistic? And what can this teach us about the experience of undergoing major shifts in consciousness, both as individuals and as societies? Here we have the social scientific domain, in which the focus tends to be on humanistic concerns, such as the intersection of consciousness, culture, and personal identity. Fields within this domain include psychology, sociology, anthropology, and so on. And they tend to ask questions, about how individuals and groups navigate and make meaning of the world, based on their particular understanding of what consciousness is, does, and super does. A consciousness concentration student might design a research study around a question such as, for example, how do members of a particular cultural group understand the ultimate nature of consciousness? And how does this understanding shape the way they make meaning of the world, approach problems of existence, relate to one another, and so on and so forth. So finally, we have the study of consciousness, looking at it through the domain of the arts and humanities. And this is a really exciting domain, and one that I'd really like to see more consciousness studies students dive into. The arts and humanities domain is primarily concerned with the creative and imaginative expressions of consciousness. How do human beings express their understanding of what consciousness is, does, and super does through forms of creative expression, such as music, visual arts, literature, film, theater, etc. This domain is also a chance for students to unleash their own creative expression and use their own art practices as a means of exploring consciousness. And, in addition to perhaps doing some sort of art project that transmits and translates some of your own relationship to consciousness through some sort of art, a student might also do a process paper, let's say, that might ask the question, for example, how are dreams, visions, hallucinations, and so on represented in literature, art, music, theater, etc.? So, yeah, personally, I'd love to see somebody do a thesis on how consciousness and theories of consciousness are portrayed in the science fiction genre. That's my wish. Anyway, very open to possibilities, and I find this one particularly exciting, especially I feel it's very underutilized at Goddard, and I'd love to see more students take advantage of the opportunities within studying consciousness in this particular domain. All right, so defining consciousness. So it's been said that the human mind is the only thing in existence trying to understand itself, which kind of, in some ways, makes our attempts at studying consciousness a little like a dog chasing its own tail. You know, speaking for myself, I don't expect we will ever have an absolute definition of what consciousness is, does, or super does, but I do believe that it's very important for consciousness studies students and anyone aligning themselves with this particular field to formulate their own loose definition of consciousness, if only as a jumping off place and a way of being able to communicate the assumptions that are inherent within their own theories. Again, this definition should be loose and open enough to allow for revision as you develop new ideas, information, and experiences. So, for example, I'll give my own definition. Here's the definition I tend to use in my own work. Consciousness is the process by which the total sum of experience, information, knowledge, and understanding become available to us through states of ordinary and non-ordinary awareness. As human beings, we are in every moment experiencing and being transformed by the world through both ordinary and non-ordinary means, whether we are consciously aware of it or not. So, as you can see in this definition, it reveals a lot about what my particular interest and research focus is all about. My focus is on the social scientific, specifically the anthropological lens of consciousness. So this definition is specifically geared toward showing my interest in both ordinary and not ordinary states of consciousness and how these various states influence and transform human beings' experiences of being a being in the world. As a consciousness researcher, I really urge you to take some time to come up with a good working definition. Again, one that's solid enough to ground your work and help you communicate it to others, but also loose enough that it can change as your understanding changes. And actually, if you work with me, it will likely be a requirement. Speaking of requirements, let's talk about the concentration requirements for being a consciousness studies student at Goddard. Basically, I'm recording this in the fall of 2022. So if you're watching this after that, be aware that things may change in terms of the requirements for graduation. So just make sure that you discuss with me or your advisor what the current expectations are. But speaking for the present moment, in order to successfully complete your studies here in GGI with a consciousness studies designation on your transcript, you will need to declare your intent to be a consciousness studies student by the end of your G1 semester, demonstrate an understanding of central concerns and questions across consciousness studies, demonstrate mastery of your chosen focus, develop an engaged practice, which means sharing your work with your community in some way, and that can be long-term or short-term, and you can discuss what this might look like with your advisor and with me and so forth. You will need to write an identity paper in which you reflect upon your personal professional relationship to the study of consciousness. And then finally, complete a final product that touches on some area of the study of consciousness. Our consciousness studies community. So I always say one of Goddard's greatest gifts really is its community. And yeah, as a consciousness studies concentration student, I really urge you to take whatever opportunities you can over the next 4 semesters and beyond to get to know folks who share your passion for this subject matter, even if they come at it from a different or slightly or significantly different perspective. In fact, I would say seek out people, especially if they come at it from a slightly or significantly different perspective. It's important for all of us, given that, consciousness is such a mystery and the definition of it is so dependent on where we are looking and what we're focusing on. It's definitely important to have open and respectful conversations with one another. and allow your own perspective to be broadened and shaped as this goes on. And one of the outcomes of this is that you will find and develop strong allies in the field who can really be invaluable support to you and your research at Goddard and beyond. For example, in the future, you may decide to publish a paper or write a blog or something that has to do with your chosen field. And I always know it's wonderful to get a couple people, couple colleagues to read it before it goes out to say, what have I missed? What other ways of looking at it should I maybe consider as I'm developing my argument? All right. So that's the end of the slide lecture, and we will now move on to questions and discussion. And if there's anything you'd like to discuss after we wrap up at any point throughout the semester, please do feel free to get in touch with me at any point. Yeah, so thank you for your interest in the Consciousness Studies concentration here at Goddard Graduate Institute.